Along this railway, thousands of metal rods stick out of the ground. They don't hold wires. They're not connected to anything. And on the sections where they stand, they are the reason the rails don't sink into the earth. Because these are refrigerators. No electricity, no moving parts. Their job is to keep the ground beneath the track frozen, winter after winter. This is the Qinghai-Tibet Railway, the only line connecting Lhasa to the rest of China's rail network. The train climbs past 5,000 meters, close to the altitude of Everest Base Camp. The air up here is so thin that next to every seat there's an oxygen outlet, like in a hospital ward. Plug in a tube and breathe. Medical assistance is available on board. For 20 years, people have told the same story about this railway. The altitude, the records, the views from the window. But the strangest thing about it is under the wheels. More than 500 kilometers of this route sit on permafrost, ground that remains frozen year-round. As long as it's frozen, it can carry enormous weight. But above it lies an active layer that thaws every summer, softens, and freezes again in autumn. The ground here literally breathes, rising and falling with the seasons. Now here's the trap. A railway embankment collects heat. Dark, dense, warmed by the sun, it works like a stove parked directly on ice. Build an ordinary railway here, and within a few years the ice underneath thaws deeper than winter can refreeze. The foundation gives, and the rails bend into waves. This isn't a theory. The old highway across the same plateau spent decades cracking and buckling, and most of its damage came from exactly this, thawing ground. So this railway doesn't fear the cold. It fears heat. Above all, its own. The structure itself is the main threat to the ground that's supposed to hold it. China didn't just reinforce the embankment and hope it would survive the thaw. It made a stranger move. It decided to keep the critical layer of ground beneath the rails artificially frozen. And it built an entire system to make that happen. The engineers didn't dare build right away. Back in 1961, a research station appeared on the slope of Fenghuoshan Mountain, set up to answer one single question. How does frozen ground behave when you disturb it? They raised trial embankments and measured, year after year, how the earth shifted beneath them. Before the first real tracks were laid across the permafrost, engineers had already been studying it for 4 decades. The first solution was the simplest material on Earth: rock. Instead of packed soil, the embankment was built from coarse crushed stone, fist-sized rocks with open gaps between them. It sounds careless. It's actually a thermal valve. In winter, the temperature difference sets the air between the stones in motion. Cold air sinks through the gaps, drawing heat out of the foundation. In summer, that circulation nearly stops, keeping much of the heat outside. The valve opens to cold in winter and nearly closes to heat in summer. Over a full year, the embankment removes more heat from the ground than it allows back in. But on the most vulnerable stretches, rock isn't enough, and this is where the rods come in. Inside each one is a liquid. In winter, when the air gets colder than the ground, the warmth of the ground makes the liquid boil. The vapor rises, dumps its heat into the freezing wind through finned radiators, turns back into liquid, and flows down for the next round. Cycle after cycle, all winter long. In summer, the temperature difference flips, the cycle stops, and the rod stops actively moving heat into the ground. This is not a refrigerator that runs all the time. It's a one-way winter pump with no motor at all. All winter, it draws heat out of the earth, and in summer, it simply switches itself off. No fuel, no wires, no crew. There are about 15,000 of these rods along the line. And where the ground can't be trusted even frozen, the railway does the last thing left. It stops touching the ground. On the most difficult sections, the train runs across kilometers of viaducts over flat, open steppe. The longest of them stretches almost 12 kilometers across 1,365 piers. A bridge in the middle of a plain looks absurd. There's no river under it, no gorge. Under it is ground the engineers don't trust. The piles go deep, below the layer that breathes with the seasons. Let the surface heave up and down. The track won't feel it. The train crosses at full speed. Passengers never notice the moment the ground stops being trusted. On some stretches, the sun-facing sides of the embankment are covered with shading panels. And above it all sits Tanggula Station, 5,068 meters, the highest railway station in the world. There's a platform, there's a timetable, there's no permanent staff. The station is operated remotely. The usual way to tell this story is as a victory over altitude. But altitude, it turns out, can be bought. Oxygen generators, enriched air in the cars, expensive but solvable. Money converts into oxygen. Heat doesn't work that way. You can't pay heat off once. You can only keep removing it, constantly. So the railway lives less like a structure and more like a patient. Temperature sensors buried along the line measure the ground at different depths all year round. The data flows to a control center where they monitor not the trains, but the temperature of the ground beneath them. This isn't a wall, and it isn't a bridge. It's a life support system for a piece of frozen planet. But this system has a condition that rarely gets mentioned. For a rod to cool the ground, the air above must be colder than the earth. For the rock blanket to keep cooling the foundation, winter has to be cold enough. The whole railway runs on a winter budget of cold. For a few months a year, the plateau pulls more heat out from under the rails than summer manages to put back. Everything rests on that margin. When the line was designed, the engineers allowed for roughly 1 degree of warming over the following 50 years. Later projections came in at more than twice that. This doesn't mean the rails will drown in a bog tomorrow. The rods work. The rock blanket works. But the ice is retreating anyway. Recently, researchers scanned the ground at 36 spots where the trackbed had already begun to settle, and at 15 of them, their instruments could no longer detect any permafrost. The railway didn't defeat the thaw. It bought time and turned the thaw into a slow race. Every winter, the ground has to be repaid everything that summer took. And with every passing decade, winter has more work to do. Go back to those rods from the beginning. Now you know what they are. Not posts, needles. An IV drip put into the ground to keep it from waking up. On the other side of the world, people pump water out every single day so their country stays dry. Here, people pump heat out every winter so their ground stays frozen. The same deal, a different element. Not to win, to hold. No finish line, no day when you switch it off and go home. The train rolls on to Lhasa. Passengers breathe oxygen through thin tubes. Along the track, 15,000 metal rods spend the winter pulling heat out from beneath the rails. And the ground that an ordinary railway would have thawed is still asleep. Somehow, it works.